Hey guys, Mrs. Fox here with Unit 6.2, Pressures Build Between the North and the South. Okay, remember you are treating this like a flipped classroom with Cornell notes, so you need paper, you need highlighters, you need something to write with. You should be writing down the title and everything, getting yourself ready right now. This is definitely something that's going to build off of the 6.1 lecture. So you're going to have to do some recall from what you learned back in 6.1 as it's all starting to build and tie and weave together to get us to the Civil War, which we're almost to. Okay, so we're going to start here. This is again part one. If you're not ready, push pause at any time you need to if you're not quite done. Otherwise, here we go. Moving on to question number one. All right, Q1, Kansas-Nebraska Act. Go ahead and write that on the right-hand side of your notes. Highlight it yellow. All right, here's the deal. So for a long time, a chunk of the Louisiana Purchase territory and a little bit beyond, really, had been designated as Indian territory. Remember, we kept shooing all the Native Americans off of especially the southern lands. Remember Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears, right? And we kept shooing them off so we could have more farmland and more room to expand for the white people. And we had put them onto reservations, okay, Indian reservations. And so those existed in this territory of the Kansas-Nebraska areas, okay. However, under President Franklin Pierce in 1854, an act was passed called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, what they decided to do was, yeah, you know, we said this territory was for Native Americans, but just kidding, we need the room, okay? And so we're going to start shooing in Native Americans once again out of another area to open it up for white settlement, okay? The senator responsible for getting this bill passed, remember this name, it's going to come up later, is Stephen Douglas, okay? So Stephen Douglas gets the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, really pushes for it, and they open up this territory to white settlement. What this does is voids the Missouri Compromise, because the Missouri Compromise rules, which we reviewed again in 6.1, okay, did apply to area we owned during the Louisiana Purchase. Well, they're axing that. Nope, just kidding. We're going to change the rules. And now in the Kansas and Nebraska areas, these territories, okay, people can vote using popular sovereignty, that means voting, to decide if their territory is going to be free or slave. So what obviously happens as this has been gaining momentum for several decades now and sectionalism has taken place, and you really have a northern identity, which is anti-slavery, and you have a southern identity, which is pro-slavery at this point, people from both areas start flooding in to the territories so that they can vote and help try to, you know, create the outcome that they want by casting their vote either pro or anti-slavery. Okay, so a whole bunch of activists from both sides start flooding into these areas. If you're not ready to move on yet, push pause, okay? Get yourself a left-hand side question. I'm not going to give them to you. You are smart. You can do it. You can do it. All right, so get that question written down. When you're ready, draw a line underneath everything you just wrote all the way across your page. And here we go to the next slide. Of course, I'm going to have video clips for you all throughout, guys. There's several of them. Do you got to watch them all? Heck no, that would take quite a while. I mean, if you want to, go for it. But I'd pick and choose at least some so that you can help understand the concepts better and get it stuck, burned into your brains, okay? So make sure you take advantage of the video clip area that will be on the flipped classroom section of my website and pick and choose the ones that you want to view, okay? All right, so here we go, Q2, Bleeding Kansas. All right, go ahead and highlight that yellow and start writing, okay? So here's what happens. Between Nebraska and Kansas, they both have drama as all of these activists are flooding into them, but Kansas by far gets more out of hand and gets a lot more press. Okay, so pro and anti-slavery settlers both come into Kansas. The violence over time grows and grows and grows until eventually it becomes literal violence with bloodshed and battles, and you end up with fighting off and on for 3 years in the Kansas Territory between pro-slavery people and anti-slavery people. Okay, so it's getting, pretty serious. Lives are lost. Thus, the event being titled Bleeding Kansas, okay, because there is bloodshed from people with the North and people from the South. Okay, so one of the most famous people from the Bleeding Kansas situation is a guy named John Brown, who's pictured front and center in the picture on the slide. Okay, so John Brown is a activist for the abolitionist movement. So he's anti-slave. All right, and he believed in, hey, if violence is necessary, go for it approach. Not all abolitionists believe in a violent way to try to get slaves their freedom, but John Brown was game for anything. You got a plan, I'm going to do it. Okay, he was known as an extremist. He was willing to go to extreme lengths, whatever it took, for him to get the outcome that he wanted. So in 1855, during Bleeding Kansas, he leads a group of guys in a raid that ends up killing 5 pro-slavery people. Okay, this will ultimately domino in a outcome of creating this guerrilla warfare like engagement between the pro and anti-slavery sides. Guerrilla warfare is small groups of people going in and ambush attacking, right, other small groups of people and picking them off kind of like one by one sort of a thing. Okay, so this whole guerrilla warfare strategy kind of erupts as John Brown does it first, killing these 5 pro-slavery guys. Overall, this leads to like 200 people dying. National news, once again, pot starting to get to the point where it's going to boil over, right? With pro-slavery and anti-slavery sentiments and people and movements and everything, okay? The Whig Party, which has been in existence for a while at this point, completely falls apart over disagreements in slavery. Some of the people that were in the Whig Party were pro-slavery. Some of them were anti-slavery. And so they can't come to a compromise, and the Whig Party will fall away and disappear, all right? What will happen is the anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats will end up forming what we now know as today's Republican Party. Okay, so it's not the National Republican Party that came first. That was different. Okay, it's going to be anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats who were anti-slavery coming together and forming what we now know today as the Republican Party. Okay. Ultimately, this 3 years of bloody Kansas and John Brown and people being murdered and all this stuff ends with Kansas being admitted as a free state, okay, in 1861. So Kansas does end up coming in free. All right, highlight, 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 draw a line underneath everything you just wrote all the way across your page. Here we go. Of course, some video clips. You guys know the drill with those, okay? All right, this is an FYI slide. You don't have to write it down, but listen up because political parties and what's going on? All right, so let me help you out there. All right, so the Democratic Republican Party, remember, was one party, and they split in the 1820s because they couldn't agree on whether or not to support Andrew Jackson or to support John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, right, as president. You might remember learning that. So they split apart and they formed the Democrat Party, okay, and the Whig Party. All right, so you have the Democrats and you have the Whigs that end up taking the place of the Democratic Republican Party. All right, well then the Whig Party, as I just told you, will end up falling apart because some of the Whigs are pro-slave, some of them are anti-slave. So what happens is the anti-slave Whigs and the anti-slavery Democrats come together, okay, and will ultimately, with other abolitionists, form the Republican Party. And then so what you're left with is the Democratic Party, which at the time was pro-slavery, and the Republican Party, which at the time was anti-slavery. This is the same Democratic Party and Republican Party that still exists to this day. Obviously, over time, over 100 years later, values have changed and the look of the party has changed, but it is those same parties that have moved forward to today's world, okay? All right, so Q3, Caning of Sumner. Write it down, highlight it yellow. All right, so Moving along in the 1850s, in 1856, there is a senator. His name is Charles Sumner, and he is against slavery. He's an abolitionist, and he gives an anti-slavery speech. Okay, so Senator Charles Sumner gives an anti-slavery speech. During his speech about anti-slavery, he insults a number of times publicly, very openly, the Southern way of life, slavery, and specific families that are practicing slavery and have Southern values. One of those families was the Brooks family, a famous family at the time who are Democrats from the South. Okay, so Charles Sumner giving a speech insults the Brooks family. Preston Brooks, a member of the Brooks family, also a congressman, gets ticks off. Like, you ain't gonna diss my family like that in public. What are you thinking? And he comes down onto the floor of this public speech and starts beating Charles Sumner repeatedly with his like walking stick cane that he's got with him, okay, on the Senate floor, like in the US Senate at an official Senate meeting in Congress, okay? Yeah, and he's beating him with the cane. Covered super heavily, like wild gossip spreading along all of the newspapers in the North and the South. Again, another thing like Nat Turner's rebellion, like other rebellions going on, like the Underground Railroad, like the abolitionist movement, like the political party shifting and changing, like Bleeding Kansas, like the Compromise of 1850, all of these things, like the Fugitive Slave Act, you guys, they're building up the pressure between the North and the South. So here's yet another thing that is going to build up alliances with how Northerners feel and Southerners feel, and they are butting heads big time. Okay, people send Preston Brooks canes in the mail, like, right on, I'm sure you need a new cane after, you know, smacking the crap out of Charles Sumner, so here's a new one, and they send him canes, and it was this big thing. So it made a lot of press, and it continues to tear the North and the South apart. All right, so write that down, highlight if you need to, draw a line underneath everything you just wrote, make yourself a left-hand side question, and here we go for the next slide. Again, video clips optional, highly recommended to watch one here or there, pick and choose, guys, and those will be available for you on the Flipped Classroom page. All right, some background information about this guy. He will become a question, but this slide is FYI, so you can just listen so you kind of know the background of the story. The dude in the photo, Dred Scott. Let me give you the skinny on Dred Scott. So Dred Scott was a slave. He was a slave in Missouri, which, remember, is a slave state, right? Missouri Compromise, slave state. All right. However, during the time that he was owned by his master was a person who traveled quite a bit, and he was taken by his owner to many places, several of which where slavery was not legal. And he actually lives with his master as a slave for many, many years in free territory. Okay. Later, eventually, after several years, he's taken back to Missouri by his owner. His owner dies in Missouri. It's Dred Scott in Missouri. Dred Scott's like, well, wait a minute. I just spent like almost 20 years in free territory, and now my owner's dead. I should have my freedom. I've lived in free territories as long as I've been alive in slave territories. So yeah, and he sues. Good for him. Dred Scott sues for his freedom in 1856. Trying to claim that because he had lived in free areas for so long and his master was dead, he should have freedom. Okay. The case makes it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay. All right. Now, what happens? ... I'm going to stop this one here, and I'll meet you back for part 2 to see what happens to Dred Scott. All right. See you then. Bye, guys.